Good afternoon and welcome to Go Beyond. My name is Alyssa Robinson and I am here with our senior pastor, Reverend Daniel Humbert. And Go Beyond is a time that we have a fun conversation, sometimes debate around the message and the sermon from Sunday. And so this week, we are in week 1 of Lent and we are talking about fasting for freedom out of our series called From Empty to Full. And so I had some questions today to kind of set the groundwork around fasting. And I don't know if you'll have answers to my questions.
You always have questions. That's the problem.
The first one is a doozy because I was thinking about it. So my first question today is, when, why, and by who did fasting begin as a practice? Because it seems crazy to me that one day someone was like, I'm not going to eat to get closer to God. And I know it didn't start with Christianity. It's across multiple faith practices. But what is the history of this fasting thing?
Well, I clearly can't give you like an exhaustive or conclusive history. I'll give you what I know. And the first is, as you've already sort of indicated, one part of this is fasting is across all of the major world religions. Every one of the ones with which I'm familiar has a component of fasting, and therefore it's really cool that here's yet one other sort of commonality that we share with some other faith traditions, and for essentially the same purposes: freedom, direction, all those things. And so that's really cool. In terms of Christian fasting, it did, as you point out, start before Jesus. We use Jesus as the example this week in Matthew, but we're not clear literally who or where it started in the Jewish tradition, but a couple of the earlier passages that we know of are from the time of David, King David. So that's roughly 1,000 years before Jesus. There are references in First Kings to, there's a story in there about Jezebel and Naboth, and that they call for a fast. And so that's about 1,000 years before Jesus. There's one in the book of Ezra that identifies a fast that's roughly 800 years before Jesus. Likewise, Isaiah, the prophet, identifies fasting by then, and this is roughly almost 800 years before Jesus as well. In Isaiah's time, it's clearly common practice at that point because he's referencing it as if it's just a well-known concept. So can't pinpoint it to a single individual. It's not in the 613 Jewish laws. And so all we know is that somewhere roughly 1,000 years before Jesus, this practice started and became commonplace, that by Jesus's day, it's already so common that it's practiced 2 times a week. In fact, there's another New Testament reference in the Gospels that points out that a guy fasts 2 days a week because that was the common way that Hebrews did it. And then in the early Christian church, that's what they took up as well, was Wednesdays and Fridays, fasting on those days. So it's at this point at least 3,000 years old, and a secular reference to it comes from Hippocrates in the 5th century BC, references that as a health benefit. So there's even in non-sacred texts, there's information about it prior to Jesus. So it's kind of cool, kind of fascinating.
So my next practice, going to the spiritual side of things and the scriptural side of things, you were talking this week about Jesus being tempted by Satan. And I am in constant debates with people, which might be a surprise to you, of is the Bible literal or is it a metaphor? Is it something that we're supposed to learn something from the story, but, maybe Jonah was not literally swallowed by a whale, those kinds of conversations. Right. So I want to know, do you believe that the story of Satan tempting Jesus in the desert is literal or figurative?
Yeah. Well, this is a tough question, right? Because I have to own that I've struggled for decades now with this story on a couple of different levels. One is golly, would God let that kind of circumstance happen, right? That Jesus, God's child, would be tempted like that. And on the other end, this whole figure of a Satan certainly starts off radically different in the Old Testament. In the story of Job, the Satan is a very different concept, and it's not a person, it's a title given to a role played. But by Jesus's day, there's this understanding that there is sort of this figure like Satan, or what we would call the devil, that many people believed in. And so I've struggled with it for years, whether it's a factual historical event or whether it's a metaphor. I have landed on just believing that, is it possible it could have happened? Sure. And is it needful for my faith for it to be a historical event? No. But I choose to believe that it is without any kind of, factual proof of it. But I also know that, like the story of Jonah and the story of Job, neither of which were intended from their original conception to be about a historical event, they have great validity for how we understand God and how we understand the ways in which God works. And so for those for whom this story about the temptation of Jesus might be a metaphor or figurative, man, there's nothing wrong with that. That's a very helpful way for folks to know, is this an archetype, right? In other words, are we tempted? Yes. And are these some great representations of temptation? Yes, because they kind of represent very clear temptations to food or to power or to allegiance. And so whether you believe that it's an archetype of just humanity and what it's like to face temptation, or whether you believe this historically happened, either way is helpful to us as people of faith. I've landed in the historical, not because I feel it's needful, but because it helps me, right? It helps me to better understand it.
I'm in the opposite camp. I fall in the metaphorical, and I wrote in my notes, it helps me to better relate to the scripture. And I don't know if this is blasphemous or not, but it helps me to better relate to the scripture if I imagine that Satan is a piece of Jesus. And we all have that within us. We all, as humanity, which Jesus is fully God and fully human, have the capacity for good and for evil.
Yep.
And when I'm thinking about my fast and the times that I'm saying, like, who cares? At the end of the day, who cares if I turn on the TV or whatever it is? I imagine that's the voice that Jesus was hearing. Like, what does it do to anyone if I have a piece of bread when I'm hungry?
Right.
And so I imagine that it is that internal dwelling within us that lives within each of us that is pushing us away from God.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that can be helpful for folks. And when I teach Bible studies and we get to, again, things like Jonah and Job, I just say to folks, look, if it's helpful for you to know and believe that this happened in history, all the better. But if, on the other hand, it simply represents how it is we face suffering or how it is we face our temptations, either way works, because that's the point, right? So that's cool.
Well, and in our sermon notes from Sunday, let me pull them up so that I give the exact wording. I'm in the Treach app right now.
Oh, wait, there's a cool Treach app?
So you specifically defined fasting as voluntary denial of something for a specific time for a spiritual purpose.
Uh-huh.
And in the conversations, because I've been doing this daily podcasts, and in the conversations that I've had with people, what they've struggled with the most, surprisingly, is the specific time. Because it's almost like, if we're only doing it for 40 days, what's the point? If it's not a permanent change, what's the point?
Yeah.
And so that has been, in the conversations I've had, that's the struggle of, like, why are we only doing it for a specific point in time? So can you give me a little bit more information about why it matters that there's a start date and an end date to this?
Yeah, I make up that one of the reasons people struggle with the time frame is because number one, 40 days is a long time, and number two, does it always have to be 40 days? And then I guess thirdly, golly, why, as you pointed out, is a time frame necessary when we really need to think of it in terms of the biblical images, because the fast that Jesus had in the wilderness for 40 days, and by the way, that doesn't literally mean 40 days. Anytime 40 is referenced in the Bible, that just means it's a long time. But that's really one of the only, I'm trying to remember, there might be one other one where an extended time like this is identified. Usually the fasts in the biblical models are 1, 2, 3 days. They're short periods of time, and they are to be abstained from food specifically and for the whole day. And so those reasons are for what I just referred to as intensity, that it causes great focus and that it causes great clarity for the person participating in it. And so the designated time frame is because typically it would be too hard to extend the fast beyond that, right? If it were again in the biblical model, if it's fasting from food all day for 40 days or all day for 3 days, man, that's too intense to do all the time. On the other hand, if it's in our modern day time, things like media or news or social media or anything like that, by golly, we could do that all the time. But again, coming back to the concept of the fast, it's for this spiritual connection. And I think if 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 we're all honest, which we ought to be, but we aren't often, is with regard to our spirituality, if something becomes rote or if something becomes so commonplace, it just doesn't happen anymore. That's why a time frame is helpful, because in our humanity, we can't do it all the time. We think we can or we want to, but the reality is we won't. And a simple example is we all know that scripture is a really good thing to read and that we ought to read it every day, right? But we know that most of us don't. But if I'll commit myself to 40 days or 21 days or whatever, I'll do it for that time. And then some of us will quit, but some of us will keep it going. But it took that intentionality over a specific time frame to make it work. So that's why a time frame is helpful. It just makes it more intense, more focused, and more deliberate. And if we're lucky or fortunate, we'll keep going. But the reality is most of us won't.
Well, those are all of the questions that I had. Turns out they were easy ones. So
I don't know about that.
So thank you everybody for joining us today. And as always, you can catch previous episodes at tmumc.org/go beyond. And you've heard us talk about Lenten worship, the TMUMC app, the podcast. We've got so much stuff going on, and you can catch all of it at tmumc.org/Lent. And there's great resources there for you to get started fasting, for you to hear stories from other people, to learn about worship experiences that we have coming up. So I'd invite you to go to tmumc.org/Lent and continue this journey with us.